Reunido el 6 de marzo de 2023 en la sede de la Fundación BBVA en Madrid, España, para deliberar y decidir, el jurado ha resuelto otorgar el Premio Fundación BBVA Fronteras del Conocimiento en la categoría de Humanidades a Steven Pinker, Universidad de Harvard, Peter Singer, Universidad de Princeton. El Premio Fronteras del Conocimiento en Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales reconoce a dos pensadores, Steven Pinker y Peter Singer, que por caminos distintos pero convergentes se han distinguido en la defensa de la racionalidad y el altruismo pragmático como principales fuerzas del progreso ético en la historia de la humanidad. Se trata, además, de dos investigadores que se admiran mutuamente, que han procurado llevar sus conocimientos interdisciplinares a la esfera pública. El trabajo de Steven Pinker ha compaginado logros muy destacados en psicología cognitiva evolucionista con análisis sumamente perspicaces en las condiciones del progreso humano. Su visión de este progreso ofrece una perspectiva optimista anclada en la razón, la ciencia y el humanismo. Peter Singer, uno de los filósofos morales más influyentes en la actualidad, marcó un punto de inflexión al extender y fundamentar la ética aplicándola al dominio de los animales, su gran aportación, con notables consecuencias para la legislación internacional sobre el bienestar animal y el progreso moral.
How do you define rationality, and why do you consider it to be the main driving force of moral progress in human history?
Rationality can be defined as the use of knowledge to attain goals, where knowledge can mean facts about how the world works, it can mean the laws of logic, the laws of probability, the laws of cause and effect. Rationality by itself can't drive moral progress because we can always use knowledge and intelligence to develop destructive technologies like better weapons or biological agents. But when rationality is deployed in service of maximizing human well-being, that is what can drive human progress, that is what has driven human progress.
What are the defining features of human nature, and to what extent do our innate biological tendencies remain an obstacle for the expansion of rationality?
Human nature is a complex system. It's not just one thing. We have in ourselves a number of motives that are corrosive or destructive, like the capacity for exploitation, the drive for dominance, the thirst for revenge, the ability to experience sadism. On the other hand, human nature also has what Abraham Lincoln called our better angels. That is, faculties like self-control, like empathy, like a moral sense, like cognitive processes that can solve problems. Progress happens when we develop norms and institutions that can bring out our better angels, that make us inhibit our urge for dominance or exploitation, partly under the influence of discourse with others. When two people get together and they have to find common ground, that common ground will be their common humanity. Neither one can exploit the other.
To what extent can we say that humanity has already achieved genuine progress, and what are the fundamental conditions which can continue to expand the betterment of human society?
Human progress is not just an aspiration. It's not a matter of optimism, like seeing the glass as half full. It's a matter of looking at facts, at data on the human condition over time. And if you try to estimate aspects of human well-being at different times in history. How long did people live? How many wars did they fight? How often did they murder each other? How often did they enslave each other? How sick did they get? How many children died in the first few years of life? How many mothers died giving birth? And plot them over time, you see in just about every one of those curves, the bad things about the human condition have decreased. That is, life has gotten better. That's not a matter of temperament, of optimism. It is a fact about history. It didn't happen by itself. There is no such thing as an arc of progress that magically makes us better and better. Quite the contrary, the laws of nature try to grind us down. But when we apply knowledge to improve the human condition, sometimes we can succeed if we remember what works, and if we try not to repeat our mistakes, progress can happen.
Could you explain the fundamental arguments by which you extend the scope of moral responsibility to animals and thus expand the circle of ethics?
The fundamental argument for expanding the sphere of ethics to non-human animals is that the boundary of our species is not itself a morally crucial distinction. We're used to situations in the past where people have drawn boundaries around groups of beings that we can see was really for their own convenience and their own ability to exploit others rather than on some real basis. The boundary of the white race, for example, is the most obvious, that was used to justify slavery. And men have also drawn the boundaries around men rather than women in some instances. Now, when we look at the boundary of species, again, it's our species justifying our exploitation and often literally enslavement of non-human animals. And we need to ask, why is that boundary of species so important? And when we do ask that question, the usual answers don't really work. People may say, well, we are more rational, or we are self-aware, or we can use language, as I'm now using it. But it's not true that all members of the species Homo sapien are more rational or more able to use language, more self-aware than some non-human animals. None of us were when we were infants, for example. And some, unfortunately, will never have those abilities. So if we look more critically at the use of that boundary, we can see the purposes that it served. And I think we can see that what really matters is whether beings can experience a life that is good for them. That is, a happy or fulfilling or rewarding life, a life free of pain, a life with pleasure. And that clearly applies to a very large range of non-human animals. They're capable of feeling pain as we are. And I would argue that the fact that they are not members of the species Homo sapien does not in any way make their pain less important ethically than the pain of a member of our species. Pain is pain, and it's equally bad whichever being suffers it. What we ought to be looking at is how severe is the pain, how long does the pain last, and we should give equal consideration to the similar pains of all beings, irrespective of their race, their sex, their nationality, and their species.
To what extent do you think that as a result of philosophical work almost 5 decades ago, the welfare of animals has improved through international legislation and a gradual shift in people's moral attitudes?
It's always hard to say to what extent my own work has played a role in improving the situation of non-human animals, because there's been a large movement since the 1970s working for those objectives, and to some extent even before that. But the publication of my book Animal Liberation in 1975 has been regarded as being a trigger for the modern animal rights movement. Some people have referred to it as the Bible of the animal rights movement. And I know that it has brought more people into the movement, because very often when I speak somewhere publicly, people come up with a copy of the book and say, this changed my life, I stopped eating animals, or I joined the animal movement. So I know that it's contributed. And collectively, the work that I've done and the work that millions of other people have done, has started to make a difference in the way animals are treated. A lot of the practices that I described in the first edition of Animal Liberation, for example, keeping hens in wire cages so small that they can't even stretch their wings, or keeping veal calves or pigs in stalls that were too narrow for them to turn around or walk more than a single step. Those practices are now illegal across the entire European Union and in some parts of the United States, like California, and in some other countries as well. So we have been making progress in that respect. Also in the area of the use of animals in experimentation, there are somewhat more control over that. Again, the European Union has been a leader. You're not allowed to test cosmetics on animals, for example, in the European Union. So there's been significant progress, but there's also still a very long way to go.
What do you see as the main remaining challenges that lie ahead to improve animal welfare, and what steps should be taken to achieve them?
The biggest challenge that we have to improve animal welfare is to do something about the commercial raising and killing of animals for food, because that is by far the largest area of human abuse of animals. If we just talk about vertebrate animals on land, we're talking about something like 70 to 80 billion animals produced each year. And if we include fish as well, that would add another 120 billion to the total tally. So this is a huge area of animal suffering. Very often there's really only the concern to produce the animals as cheaply as possible and little or no concern for the well-being of the animals. So I really think we need to try to stop this. We need to try to get people to shift to plant-based foods, or alternatively we need to develop meat, animal products that we produce at the cellular level. So molecularly you're talking about meat, but no animal has suffered. And the other factor that's important here is that the greenhouse gas emissions of the meat industry are very significant. And if we can replace that meat with plant-based foods or with cellular meat, we will dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions and give ourselves more time to avoid that tipping point where the climate of the entire planet is irreparably damaged for centuries to come.